By way of morning prayer, I've chosen a prayer that I was first introduced to by the Missionaries of Charity. I had the great fortune of working with their community when I was living in Rome. And in any time that I've had an opportunity to be in other convents of the Missionary of Charities, they would pray this prayer. And so I just always assumed it was something that Mother Teresa wrote. And then one day I was trying to find a copy of it, so I Googled it, and I saw that it was in fact a prayer written by John Henry Newman, the great 19th century English priest. And so I thought, well, you know what, that's kind of plagiarism in the best way in the church, right? Mother Teresa found it, it became part of their community. And so I'd like to share it because it really so emphasizes to me what it means that we're sent to go out into the world. And so we begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Jesus, help me to spread your fragrance everywhere I go. Flood my soul with your spirit and life. Penetrate and possess my whole being so utterly that my life may only be a radiance of yours. Shine through me and be so in me that every soul I come in contact with may feel your presence in my soul. Let them look up and see no longer me, but see only Jesus. Stay with me, and then I shall begin to shine as you shine. So to shine as to be a light to others. The light, O Jesus, will be all yours. None of it will be mine. It will be you shining on others through me. Let me thus praise you the way you love best, by shining on those around me. Let me preach you without preaching, not by words, but by my example, by the touching force and the sympathetic influence of what I do, the evident fullness of the love that I bear for you. Amen. Amen. I just have one thing to add to this beautiful prayer, kind of a both and, as very much as part of the Catholic tradition. As many of you know by now, if you've been here, I live in Washington, D.C. And so I live in neighborhoods where there's both a lot of people who work for the Secret Service, and there are people who are protected by the Secret Service. So it's not unusual to round the corner and to see a big black SUV and to see someone sitting inside it with the radio always at the ready. I go to daily Mass at St. Joseph's on Capitol Hill, and often Justice Thomas is there. And so you walk into Mass and you see his security detail standing at the door, and then you see him in the pew, generally with one or two or three of his staff, because he invites everybody to come to morning Mass with him who would like to. And so in general, it makes you feel very, very safe most of the time. But these Secret Service agents remind me also a lot of Catholics when it comes to evangelization. So Pope Francis calls us agents of evangelization. And I would like to say that among Christians, Catholics are like the Secret Service of evangelizers, right? We are so much better at being quiet, but radiating the love of Christ. And we're so much better at doing things. And if catastrophe strikes, we might be willing to say something, right? But this is not the kind of evangelization we're being called to in this day and in this age. Yes, sometimes we can preach without preaching, but other times we're being asked to share the good news. And to share the good news means we need to use words, right? There comes a time when you're raising your kids that you start saying, now use your words, right? Because this is the way that we relate to one another and that we interact. And so today, I thought it would be great to round up our time together by talking about what it means to use our words to share good news. Because how many of you have ever shared good news without using words? Right? The only time I can think we might do that is if we post a photo on Facebook of our new child or grandchild. But don't you want people to ask, well, what's the baby's name? Well, when was the baby born? Well, who does the baby look like? Right? Good news always offers the opportunity for more conversation. And this is exactly what we're being asked to do in sharing the joy of the gospel. I use use the language everyday evangelizer because I really want Catholics to feel comfortable in thinking about themselves as evangelizers. Pope Francis uses, in the Joy of the Gospel, people-to-people ministry. And this is what he says about that. He says, today, as the Church seeks to experience a profound missionary renewal, there is a kind of preaching which falls to each one of us as a daily responsibility. It has to do with bringing the gospel to the people we meet, whether they be our neighbors or complete strangers. This is the formal preaching which takes place in the middle of a conversation, something along the lines of what a missionary does when visiting a home. Being a disciple means being constantly ready to bring the love of Jesus to others. And this can happen unexpectedly in any place, on the street, in the city square, during work, or on a journey. In this preaching, and he's talking to all of us here, right? And he calls it preaching because he's talking about the way in which we witness to the faith. So in this preaching, which is always respectful and gentle, the first step is personal dialogue. That was almost word for word what Father Ricky said yesterday when someone asked, how do we begin the most difficult kind of conversations we have to have? And Father Ricky said, and Pope Francis would agree with them, that it always begins with respectful dialogue. I think the other thing to put our mind at ease, or to make us courageous enough to want to be able to take the opportunities when they present themselves to do this, is to remember that we have to be ourselves. That what's going to speak to people is the way that we can be most naturally ourselves. In my first couple of weeks in Tanana, when you were trying to get to know people, and I was hoping that they were trying to get to know me, it really struck me that as a 21-year-old, the way we tend to want to get to know each other is we talk about, well, where we grew up, and maybe where our families went on summer vacation, and what school you went to, and maybe what league you played in. And here I found myself in this village on the Tanana River, and people barely knew Philadelphia. They certainly didn't have a sense necessarily of what colleges dotted the Northeast, and I had never traveled at that point west of the Mississippi River, so vacations weren't, taken in the same places. And at a certain point I thought, who am I offering to people? Like, who am I, and how do they get to know me, and how do I get to know them? Because I knew nothing about hunting. One day they said, hey, let's go fishing. And we got down there, and they gave me a pole, and I was like smiling. And all of a sudden they said, you don't fish, do you? And I said, never. And so I thought, how's this going to work? And it was the greatest lesson I could have learned as a 21-year-old, right? Because I thought, you know what? I just got to be me. That's what I have to offer. And so it was beautiful to, at 21, say, well, who is me when I can't rely on all these outside external ways we sometimes describe who we are. We kind of had to get at the heart. And isn't that exactly the experience, certainly of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, to teach us to be missionaries for Christ? And so the first thing we have to say is work with what you have. Work with the gift of who God made you to be, and be yourself. I often think sometime I would love to preach like the great African American preachers who have these beautiful turns of phrases, who can be so clever in the rhythmic way they can draw people in. But that's not my culture, right? And I can take pieces of it and make it my own, but that's a particular gift of a particular style of preaching. And so the first thing is to say, well, how can I best be myself? Because that's what people want to see. The second rule that flowed from first being gentle in our conversation is always to be humble. If you went to Sister Kathy's workshop, she talked about meek and what it means to be meek. And I think that that's exactly this idea, right? That in our gestures, in our active listening, we want to communicate to the other that this is going to be a conversation and a dialogue. That it's not going to be a sermon, but it's going to be a proposal and an experience of sharing Jesus in our lives. find the words to enter into this dialogue? How do we find the words to tell the story of our faith? Pope Francis gives us two things not to do. And I think, again, might be new to Catholics. The first thing he says is, it's not always the right time to use a fixed formula, right? And one of the strengths of our faith is we have a lot of clear teachings. And so it's easy sometimes to name the teaching. But what if someone asks you, well, what does that mean? So I taught an RCIA class one night on the Eucharist. And at the end of the class, a young woman came up to me and she said, Susan, put all the theology aside and tell me why you believe Jesus is really present in the Eucharist. And I stood there and I thought, 'cause. We who are cradle Catholics and you grow up with it, it's like we know it deep down, as Bishop Andrew talked about, the way we experience joy. And so sometimes it's really hard to find the words to get at something that we've always known and we've always believed. Thank God we have converts to the faith who sometimes are a little bit more free and able to bring the language to help us find our own language, because they've done this and they've asked the questions as adults. And so we can't always just stop at, well, the church teaches. It can sometimes be a good starting point, but sometimes I think to be able to say, in my life I've experienced this, and the church confirms, and that way it helps people sometimes build a bridge. The second thing that Pope Francis says is, it's not some magic group of sayings that helps people come to encounter Christ. So it's not that we're always looking for just the right way to say something, or looking up in a book to have something and to memorize it, and no matter what the question may be, this is going to be our answer. That's not always the best way, right, to engage in conversation. And so what it really is the words that come most naturally to us from our own experience. For example, if I were to ask you to share what the sacrament of reconciliation means to you, we would have a number of really beautiful responses to that. And I imagine we would have some key themes, but lots of different ways we describe why the sacrament is so important to us. And at the end of the day, all of those things would describe that in the sacrament of reconciliation, we receive God's love and God's grace, and sometimes God's healing mercy. And so it helps us to say, mercy means, because that's part of my experience in the sacrament. And so sometimes what keeps Catholics from wanting to share their faith is they're afraid that they don't know enough, because we know we've got this rich, huge tradition of knowledge that we could draw on and to share. And sometimes I think we're afraid that we might have the wrong answer. And maybe sometimes we do, but that's where the Holy Spirit can help make it right. But if we can talk from our experience, then we're never starting off at the wrong place, because it's our experience. This handout that I gave you is the response in some way to a man who had lost his wife. And he was talking to me about the fact that he had 4 adult kids. And in his mind, he was always going to die first. And so one of the things that he was struggling with is he really didn't have an idea of what life might look like with his wife having died and he there with his kids. And so he said one of the things that he began to think a lot about was, if I'm the sole parent left, what would my wife most want me to communicate to the children, and what would she want me to do by way of helping them grow in the faith? And so he said, I decided that what she most wants me to communicate is why the Eucharist is so important. And then he looked at me and he said, but I don't have the words. I don't know what to say. And he said, what I've done is, I'm going to invite them, each one to dinner one at a time. And I'm going to talk to each one of them, because they're all at different places with the church. He said, I know one of my daughters goes, I'm not sure if the other one goes to church at all, I'm not sure where my son is, he's newly married, but I'm going to take each one and invite them to dinner. And then he said, but help me find the words to explain. And so I thought, the words might not be coming easily, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't have them, because he believes in the Eucharist, and it is a priority. And so one of the first things I said to him is, well, how would your wife begin to talk about what it means to go to Sunday Mass and to receive our Lord in the Eucharist? How have you and she talked about it? That might be the beginning of the sharing. And so what we wanted to do then was to say, okay, what can we put together that helps us take our experiences and take our language and craft some of the language we could take to these everyday conversations. Another inspiration for this type of presentation and workshop was one of the priests in the diocese told a great story at a conference one time. He said a young man in his parish came to him and said, Father, I want to make an appointment to talk with you sometime because I have a new job, and there's a lot of fundamentalist Christians on the job, and they're forever asking me if I've been saved or if I've accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I want some better language to help respond. And he said, I'd be happy to talk with you, we can make an appointment, but just to help me get thinking, what do you say when they ask you that? And he said, oh, don't worry, Father, I tell them no, I'm a Catholic. There's something so true to that, right? Because that's not our language to ask people if they've accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. But goodness, we do believe, right, that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior. And so there's a way in which we have to say, okay, what makes us most comfortable is to use the language that we're familiar with, right? So we talk about the living Christ, and we talk about our belief that we will be called to go to heaven, and we have the hope of living with God eternally, which is another way of saying that Jesus is our Lord and Savior. And so, but sometimes I think we also know that Catholic language can be a mystery to people who aren't Catholic. Sometimes we forget that those of us who grew up with the language, it's like an inside baseball kind of language sometimes. There's a campaign in a number of dioceses during Lent to welcome back inactive Catholics to confession, and it's called The Light is On for You. Because Catholics of a certain age know exactly what it means that the light is on, because they remember the confessional light. And that's good language to reach to other Catholics, but think about someone who's never seen a confessional. Light could conjure up something different, hopefully welcoming, but that's a connection that we know because of that experience. So sometimes we have to give ourselves the chance to say, okay, let me make sure that this language is understandable to those who might not be as familiar with the way Catholics talk about Catholic faith and Catholic life. So what was developed was this 4-stage process. And what I would love for us to do is I would love you to take it home and work on it yourself when we have more time. Today, I'm going to give us a taste of this process because I think it gives you an opportunity to bring together some of the great things you've heard in these talks and in the workshops that we went to that have all circled around this idea of how do we understand what it means to be continually called to a deeper conversion? And how do we understand what it means to say yes, freely and totally, to give ourselves to God's plan that He has for us? And so, if we begin first with saying, you know what, there's God's story, and there's the way that my story fits into God's story, right? Because God created us for a specific mission and purpose. And God's invited us into His story. And so for we who are Catholics, that story begins usually rooted in the celebration of the sacraments, rooted in some of the significant moments in our journey as Catholics. And so the first thing that we like to ask people is think about some of those significant moments. Baptism, if you were baptized perhaps as a an older child or an adult, or if people have told the story of your baptism in your family, your confirmation, your quinceañera, your wedding, your marriage in the church, or religious professions. So what are those key moments in the life of a Catholic that tell something about the way we've come to understand our story and God's story? I don't remember the date of my baptism, being one of 9. It's not something my parents can remember for all 9 of us. But my husband was born and raised in Vienna, in Austria. And they have a beautiful tradition that at baptism, they get a nice big fat candle when they give the candle to the godparents or the parents. And they celebrate your name's day, because traditionally a lot of Austrians would be named either for saints or named for, or baptized on the day of the person they were named for. So they have a celebration called a name's day, and if your saint doesn't have a feast day, then they have the tradition of taking out that baptismal candle every day on the anniversary of your baptism and celebrating, much in the same way we would celebrate birthdays. And I was somewhat aware of this from my friends who were from German-speaking countries who I studied with. But the first year I was married to my husband, he's St. Joseph, and so I know St. Joseph's feast day is a big feast day, and he was actually baptized also on the feast of St. Joseph. So I thought, oh, okay, we'll have to do this name's day thing. Well, starting 2 weeks before, gifts began to arrive from his aunts, from his sister. Then his mother sent a huge box, and then his sister wrote and said, hey, what are you doing for the name's day? I thought, hey, I better start thinking about it. I got to take it up a notch. But what a beautiful celebration to celebrate that baptism the same way we celebrate birthdays, right? So what are those key markers in our Catholic life? But then the second step is to say, much as we've talked about, there are lots of ways we come to more deeply experience the presence of God in our life that happen outside of what we celebrate in the church. We're asked sometimes in living in a different culture and beginning to understand another culture helps us to look at our own with a new perspective, helps to give us new language and new images and new symbols to work with. But what have been the experiences, both the joyful ones and the sorrowful ones, that have shaped how we've come to know and to trust God and to understand the movement of God in our lives? What of these have been most powerful? The third kind of general question is, when there were changes in your life, how did that change what you knew of God and how you responded to God and react to God? Was there a before and after? It seems to me marriage, or the birth of your first child, or the death of the person closest to you in that first experience of losing someone you love. Those are experiences that we know are powerful in terms of our human journey, and also times where either faith can be a solace, or maybe faith has been really tested. And so how do we think about how those experiences tell something of our experience with God? What we're trying to lead to is this idea that you've got in your mind the basic story of your faith, that you've got in your mind that which you most want to share with others about your faith. And so that when the opportunity presents itself in a situation, you're kind of ready because you've got the tools and you've thought about it and you think, you know, the thing I most want to say is God is merciful, or I've come to believe in God's absolute, complete love of me, or hope is what I value so much about what it means to be a Catholic. So this last final question is, what I most want to share about my faith with others is. It was the way we led this dad to say, what do you most want to share about communion? And take that to the conversation with your sons and with your daughters. And so I think what we find is we've got a lot more richness and vocabulary to work with than we might think at first. And I think it helps us also to begin to think about our experiences in a new way and to be able to add some new language to it, and to realize how important our experiences are, right? For helping affirm that which we've been taught and believed. And so what I would like to do is to give you about 7 or 8 minutes to just choose one of these 4 questions, and just begin to do a little writing or a little thinking. Because what I would like us to do is to do some sharing. I think it'll be beautiful to hear some of the first fruits of these days that we've spent together, and even just to hear people who are able to say, what I most want to share about my faith is. The other thing that may be helpful for some, maybe harder for others, is that, in politics they talk about you need an elevator speech. And that is to say, you need to be able to say what you stand for in about the amount of time it takes to ride an elevator. And so sometimes they say, between a minute and 2 minutes. And so if you had 2 minutes to talk about your faith, what is it that you would most want to say? Now, some of you may think 2 minutes sounds like too short a time. But your typical television commercial is 30 seconds. And in 30 seconds, you can put a lot of information out there, right? But the other thing is, we don't want to go on and on and on. People's attention spans are getting much shorter. So something between a minute or 2 minutes is always a good starting point that people say, hey, this could be a conversation and a dialogue. So we're going to take some time now, just sit silently and to reflect, and then we'll have some time to do some sharing. But right now, let's have a little silence as you just choose one part of that to work at. Okay, now let's try that out with some sharing with each other, maybe in groups of 3. Share a little bit of what was the fruit of the piece that you wanted to reflect on. So now I want to take it the next step and say, are we as comfortable in small conversations as we are maybe being able to give testimony in a larger setting, or at least in a space like this. This is our living fully, right, that baptismal commission to be witnesses, to share in Jesus' prophetic ministry by being willing and courageous enough to give witness and to testimony to our faith. So, who would like to share with all of us one piece, at least, that you've had a chance to think about in terms of what I most want to share with about my faith with others is? So, who would like to share with us the fruits of their own reflection? Thank you. We always need a first.
Someone has to go first.
Exactly. Or else we're going to choose the people who are sitting out front here, back, listening, but far enough away from me.
I am not a real Catholic. I'm a convert. And I was an adult when I joined the Catholic Church. I still struggle with my belief. And the first part of what I wrote is the church helps form my conscience, giving me guidance in what I do, helping keep me from bad actions, and guidance, especially guidance towards good actions.
Thank you. How important, right? The fact struggle, right? It's not like we get the answer once and then we're good to go. So not being afraid to say that in the struggle, you find guidance.
So, I don't know, a lot of people have heard my story through retreats, but I was adopted at 2 weeks old, and I really didn't find out about that till I was 4, and me and my older brother were arguing, and I said something snarky like, well, at least I'm one of theirs, and he goes, no, you're not. But it led through a life, a sense that God put me in the family of heart that I was supposed to be in, and I did meet my birth mother, and I wouldn't have survived some of the things that my 5 siblings had to survive because of her bipolar. But she passed this last year, and I got to meet my 5 brothers and sisters. So there's blessings always, even in the tragedy.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful example that in that sorrow, right, you're able to see the blessing. one of our menfolk too.
When I was supposed to be making final vows, I couldn't do it because God to me was still a God of rules. So at a prayer meeting one night, I had a profound experience of God's love for me personally, and that made the biggest difference in my life. No longer did I see God as a God of rules, but God was a God of love. And so what I most want to share with other people is how much God loves each of us personally. And that is the cause of our great joy.
Amen. There we go.
One of my most profound experiences was when I was in high school, going through some very difficult experiences. Looking back, it wasn't that big, but at the time it was huge. And I was meeting with my youth director, and I shared with him, and I poured out my struggles, and he simply said, could I pray for you? And if you may not feel comfortable sharing about your faith, but if you just listen to someone else and then offer to pray for them, and actually pray, say, can we pray? You will profoundly change that person's life. That one prayer changed the whole trajectory of my existence, because I felt, like Sister Mary, that God cared about the details of my life. And it takes courage. So I encourage you right now to start praying, asking God for the courage to pray with people. Pope Francis, in his book, I think in the same section you mentioned about informal preaching, or this dialogue, he says, when appropriate, end with prayer. And so you don't necessarily have to know all about the faith or what to share about your own, but if you could just pray, that experience ushers the love of God into that person's heart in ways that you can't possibly imagine how that will affect them. So I encourage you to do that.
I don't know if anyone's ever had the experience of saying, I'll pray for you, and the other person saying, don't bother, right? I mean, no one ever turns down, I think, the opportunity to think that someone is going to pray for them or with them. Yes, okay, great.
So my elevator speech, what I want people to know about my faith. And so when I came back to the church, one of the coolest revelations was that there was someone who was the most powerful force in the universe, a person who loved me, and that he knew me, and despite the fact that he knew me, he still loved me. And unconditionally, and has a purpose for me and a plan for my life. How could you not want to share that with others?
Amen. I like that emphasis on the details, God knowing the details of your life and loving you.
I think it's already been said, but I think it's just getting to the point in my life where, I lived the Catholic faith, I went to confession,
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was an active Catholic. I was born cradle Catholic, but living your whole life, participating in the sacraments, but then finally getting to the point where you open your heart and realize what people have been saying here today, that you finally get to that point where you realize God's love and God's mercy in your life. And sometimes it takes a specific event, and sometimes it just takes a certain group of people that's around you and supporting you. But reaching that point and opening up and realizing the overwhelming mercy and love of God, that's what changed me.
I certainly haven't boiled things down into 2 minutes, but I'll pick one thing. Probably like most people, my wife and I spent a long time away from the church. You mentioned that to you yesterday. And, but at the same time, I always identified ourselves as Catholic. And so that shows me that you can profoundly trick yourself and make yourself comfortable in a situation. And as long as you do that, you never get out of that situation till you get something changed. We moved to Alaska, we thought, because I got a job offer here, and we wanted to get out of the big city. We were tired of big cities. And now, looking back on it, we both realized that we came here to return to the church and find God again. And it came with, we've been thinking about it for a long time. You know, why are we outside the church? Why aren't we practicing? What's going on? And the cathedral put an ad in the Juneau Empire for Catholics who have fallen away. And, you know, they just have a meeting, let's come on down and talk about it. And so, we saw that ad and we said, you know, it wouldn't hurt us to talk about it. So let's do that. And we did. There's a program called Landings, and we ended up coming back to the church. And that was profound in that we came back with a conviction and knowledge, not that we belong to the Catholic Church, but we have a Catholic faith. And we wanted to learn more about it, and it gave us a great zeal to read and talk to others and study. In addition, just one experience that my wife and I had when we were coming back to the church, sort of later in Landings, before we actually went to Mass again, we decided we should find out what Mass looks like these days. And so we turned on television. We knew there was a Catholic station, EWTN, on television. And but we couldn't get any sound. There was no, we saw Mother Angelica talking, but there was no sound. There was sound on all the other channels, but no sound on the Catholic channel. We called GCI and asked them about that, and they checked the cable. You know, oh, we're getting the right signal. Yes, we have it. They could hear it. Why can't we? So there was just no sound, and so we checked it all the time. You know, every day we'd go in there and turn on EWTN, and sure enough, there's no sound. So when we came back to the church, we turned on television. There was EWTN, and we heard Mother Angelica speaking to us. Now, you know, in the old days, before that, we probably would have said, well, that's a real coincidence, isn't it? But it wasn't. It was God working. And so that's the one thing that I would want to get across is that God will talk to you in a way that gets your interest. He certainly got us used to turning on EWTN. And I turned my sister on to EWTN now. She listens to that. And so God will speak to you the way you need to be spoken to. And if you come back and you think that if you know more about a hobby of yours than you do your faith, you need to change your priorities. And so that we've changed our priorities in what our reading is. I used to know more about dinosaurs than the Catholic Church. And so I said, that's crazy. You know, that dinosaurs isn't going to get me into heaven. But the church will.
The Holy Spirit must have asked us to end here. People are beginning to come in, and we need to. But did you hear in his story exactly the 4 things that we've been talking about? There was an invitation to come back and to re-explore the faith, and there was an encounter with Catholics. And then there was an accompanying of that group with you, and now you've been sent to preach to us. So I just want to end by saying that my students have had a lot of homework to do over these last couple of days while I've been here, so they weren't forgetting the class and what we were learning in class. And so I feel it's only fair to give you some homework as we end our time here. And I want you in the next couple of days to talk to a neighbor or a coworker or a family member about what you experienced here. Say, hey, you know where I was this weekend? And just throw out something you found interesting and see if you can engage them in conversation. So that's your homework, to go and to be witnesses to the good news. Thank you.